Good evening, fellow Kenyans. Tonight, I invite every Kenyan to what I believe will become the most consequential national conversation since the adoption of our Constitution in 2010. A national conversation about Kenya's development charter.
On the evening of Thursday, the 30th of July, the President of Kenya sat down in front of a camera at State House and invited the country to imagine itself a generation from now. He spoke well. He spoke in places with a candor that has been genuinely rare in Kenyan development rhetoric. He said Vision 2030 had brought us this far, but was approaching its horizon. He said some of its ambitions remain unattained. He said we are also off target. And he was right about all three. And then he asked the country to begin again. Now, a point of precision before we go further, because it shapes what follows. The president announced the process that has since become known as Vision 2060. But in his address itself, he did not call it Vision 2060, and he did not name 2060 as its target year. I've read the full text 3 times. The phrase doesn't appear. The number doesn't appear. What he announced was a national conversation about a successor development charter to be launched formally on the 12th of August, aiming at high-income, industrialized, globally competitive status. And I'm quoting exactly, within one generation. Vision 2060 is the name the press supplied. And within about 72 hours, everyone was using it. The opposition, his supporters, the commentariat. Within days, the president was publicly defending the initiative that everyone else was calling Vision 2060. The Standard, in one article, called it Vision 2063. So I'm not trying to make a gotcha out of a name. The instability of the name is actually the evidence. We are having a furious national argument about a proposed charter with no settled public title, no stated terminal year, no published pillars, no costing, and no text. That is not by itself a reason to dismiss it all. Long-term planning matters, and I'll spend a substantial part of this episode explaining why the case for it is stronger than most of its critics allowed for this week. But it's a reason to ask one question ahead of all the others. Before we discuss where Kenya wants to be in 2060, can anyone show us where the country was supposed to be in 2030? And whether we are still going to arrive? One more thing, and then we start properly. This channel doesn't hide its working, so you should hear this from me rather than find it out later. I began this episode working from 6 quotations attributed to the commentator whose analysis we are going to examine. Damning ones, the kind you build a thumbnail around. I went through every transcript looking for them. 5 of the 6 are not there. So, they're not in this episode. You won't hear them because I couldn't stand them up. Receipts of a vibes has to mean something on the days it cost you your best material, or it means nothing at all. In a Stories a Siasa conversation recorded in the immediate aftermath of the address, a man called Ndolo offered the single most useful analytical tool anybody has offered on this subject. I should introduce him properly because most coverage undersells him. He's described as a veteran political practitioner. He is rather more than that. He's a former parliamentary candidate. He stood in Kilome and was under pressure to run again in 2022. He has long relationships across the Kenyan political and media class. He's worked for years as a studio acoustic consultant, building broadcast facilities for Nation, for Radio Africa, for Capital. He is personally close to Uhuru Kenyatta's maternal uncle, who he describes as a father figure and consulted before deciding not to run. He discloses all of that himself on the record, unprompted. I'm repeating it because you should know who's talking and because he was honest enough to say it first. His argument runs like this.
When you start a company and the bank asks you, you say you're borrowing, you give projections. You say, in 5 years, this is what our projections are. And because this is what our projections are, we are confident if we take this loan, in 6 years we'll have paid it. and then the bank interrogates your projections and says this is unrealistic or this is realistic, because there's a little bit of history you're showing them.
I want to be clear about this because much of what follows will look like criticism of Mr. Ndolo, and I'd rather you judged it fairly. That analogy is excellent. It is precisely the correct test. It is the one I'd have reached out for myself. A country asking its citizens to accept a 35-year plan is in exactly the same position of a borrower walking into a bank. And a bank does not lend against, enthusiasm. It does not approve a facility because the applicant has a long horizon and an admirable attitude. It asks for the previous plan, what was projected, what was delivered, what the gap was, and what explains it. And it asks for the audited accounts. Ndolo hands us the instrument. And then, within the same conversation, he doesn't use it.
See, when I heard Vision 2030, I was impressed because of one thing and one thing only. It was not pegged to the 5-year political cycle. So this somebody was saying, even when I'm not president, this is where we should go. So in the same light, what William Samoei said, before we dive into the document, the fact that he's talking about 2060 is a good thing. He's telling Kenyans, this is where we are going. And let's not get caught up in whatever dislike we have for the president. Let us realize that he's drawing a roadmap beyond him.
So by his own account, he listened to the speech that morning. Early start, headphones, iPad. He's describing a fast reaction and he's honest about that. And there's nothing wrong with that reaction. But he arrives quite quickly at a conclusion that the roadmap is a good thing, that the president is thinking beyond himself. Kenyans shouldn't let the dislike of the man contaminate their judgment of the plan. He reaches that conclusion without establishing a proper baseline, without naming a single Vision 2030 indicator, without a performance record, a financial model, a transition mechanism, or an accountability provision. He gives us the loan application form and approves the loan without opening the file. So, let's open it. 10th of June, 2008, President Mwai Kibaki launches Kenya Vision 2030. This was not a wish. It was a structured document built over 8 months of national consultation between October 2006 and May 2007, then taken back out to every province before it was finalized. Whatever else you want to say about Vision 2030, it was made properly, the way you'd want a national plan to actually be made. The stated objective was to transform Kenya, exact wording here, a newly industrializing middle-income country providing a high quality of life to all of its citizens in a clean and secure environment by 2030. 3 pillars: economic, social, political. The economic pillar had one defining number, an average of 10% annual GDP growth sustained through 2030. The social pillar promised a just and cohesive society, health, education, housing, water, a clean environment. The political pillar promised an issue-based, people-centered, accountable democratic system. And it was to be delivered in 5-year installments, medium-term plans, 1, 2, 3, and then 4, covering 2023 to 2027. Hold on that last one because it matters more than anyone is actually admitting. Medium-term plan 4 remains the government's operative national development plan through 2027. It isn't finished. It hasn't expired either. It is a plan being executed today, as we speak. It is our roadmap. I want you to see this because medium-term plan 1 to 3, complete. Medium-term plan 4, still in progress or operative. And notice something we've all quietly forgotten. Vision 2030 was never an infrastructure list. It was a promise about lives, quality of life, equity, cohesion, a clean and secure environment. And we remember it as roads. That is not what it said it was. 18 years in, let's do what the bank would do. There's a lazy version of this segment where I tell you everything failed. You feel appropriately furious and you learn absolutely nothing. That isn't an audit, that's a mood. So we are doing all of it. Let's start with what moved. Poverty. The share of Kenyans living below the national poverty line fell from 46.8% in 2005 to 38.6% in 2021. That's roughly 8 percentage points across a period when the population grew substantially. Real and worth saying plainly. Water. The proportion of Kenyans using basic drinking water services rose from 45.4% at the turn of the century to 65.6% in 2024. Deaths fell from around 227,000 a year in 2003 to about 139,000 by 2019. Electricity. Access reached 76.2% of the population by 2023 as per the World Bank figures. That is one of the genuinely spectacular achievements of this period, and it doesn't get said enough. Total generation now runs at just over 15,000 gigawatt hours a year, and more than 90% of it is renewable, geothermal and hydro. Kenya generates some of the cleanest power on this God-freaking planet. Let's talk about education. 3.1 million learners in pre-primary school, 10.7 million in primary and junior high, 4.3 million in secondary. Look at those last two numbers. 10.7 million in primary and junior high school, 4.3 in secondary. That gap is not a mystery of arithmetic. It is a transition cliff, and every child in it is an Article 43 education right that thinned out somewhere between Standard 1 and Form 1. Then the institutional picture. If you think of devolution, 47 counties, constitutionally guaranteed revenue transfer, a structural shift of power away from the center that has now survived 3 administrations. I want to be careful about how that gets counted, though. The constitutional settlement and devolution fulfill central aspirations of Vision 2030's political pillar. But their history and causation run well beyond the vision program itself. The constitutional review process began in the 1990s and was accelerated by the catastrophe of 2007-2008. Vision 2030 did not produce the constitution. They were parallel products of the same national moment, and a government claiming full credit for one on the strength of the other is overreaching. Talk about infrastructure. The Thika Superhighway, the standard gauge railway, port expansions, geothermal generation that is, without exaggeration, world class. A national fiber backbone that changed how this whole country works and operates. And 2025, Kenya entered the IMD World Competitiveness Ranking for the first time and placed first in Africa. But now, that last one, watch how a true fact behaves when you remove its context. Because you'll hear this claim constantly between now and 2027. Kenya ranked first in Africa. Completely true. Completely verifiable. Kenya placed 56 out of 69 economies. It was Kenya's debut. The country had never been ranked before because it had never previously met the data requirements. And only 6 African countries qualified for the index at all. Kenya 56, Botswana 59, Ghana 61, South Africa 64, and Namibia 68. First in Africa, out of 6, 56th in the world. Every word of the claim is true. Standard this episode applies throughout. Not is it a lie. The question is, what does it prove and what does it not prove? The target was an average of 10% sustained. 18 years in, Kenya has never achieved the sustained 10% growth trajectory that defined the economic pillar. There were stronger individual years. 2021 delivered a 7.6% post-pandemic rebound, but those are spikes and recoveries, not a durable double-digit transformation. The government's own medium-term Plan 4 presentation records 4.5% in 2012, 3.8% in 2017, 4.8% in 2022. Kenyan National Bureau of Statistics puts 2025 at 4.6%. 18 years of a plan whose entire economic logic depended on a sustained 10% growth, and the sustained 10% never arrived. Think of income status. Kenya crossed into lower middle income in 2014 at $1,430 per person. Genuine milestone, and it should be said as one. Now, the target? The formal vision document projected average annual income per person rising above the $3,000 at 2006 prices. Current dollar GDP per capita figures cannot be compared directly with that. So this episode isn't going to pretend they can. You'll hear people do it in both directions over the next year. They'll be wrong in both directions. What is clear and comparable is this. The World Bank still classifies Kenya as a lower middle income, not upper middle income. Whatever series you prefer, the classification has not moved since 2014. The vision was to make Kenya a newly industrializing country, and the state's own industrialization target is 20% of GDP by 2030. Manufacturing currently sits somewhere between 7 and 8%. I'm giving you a range rather than a decimal, deliberately, and I'll explain why in the description. The figures circulating for this are not consistently sourced, and I'd rather be roughly right in public than precisely wrong. What is not in dispute is the direction and the distance. The sector has been shrinking as a share of the economy across the vision period. And it's nowhere near 20%. It's barely a third of the way going there. And actually, going the wrong way. Let me read that again. The sector has been shrinking as a share of the economy across the vision period. And it's nowhere near the 20%. It's barely a third of the way there. And it's actually going the wrong way. The mechanisms was industrialization. The roads weren't the point. The roads were supposed to enable the point. And the mechanism went backwards. And now hold that against the electricity figure I gave you a few minutes ago. Kenya built world-class renewable generation, 15,000 gigawatt hours, over 90% clean. That is the enabling condition for exactly the kind of manufacturing economy Vision 2030 said it actually wanted. Cheap, abundant, low-carbon industrial power, the thing that half the world is currently scrambling to build. And over the same period, manufacturing shrank as a share of the economy. We built the power stations and never built the factory. That is the whole story of this vision in one sentence. It is not a story about corruption or bad faith. It is a story about a country that got extremely good at enabling conditions and never taking the next steps. 3.31 million formal jobs against 18.1 million informal. 83.8% of working Kenyans work informally. On the KNBS Real Wage Index, where June 2009 equals 100, a real wage now sits at around 85.8. That is not a projection or a modeled estimate. That's the government's own statistician saying that the average Kenyan informal employment takes home materially less in real terms than their counterpart did 17 years ago. And debt? At the end of February this year, public and publicly guaranteed debt stood at 12.844 trillion shillings. On the Treasury's own definition, that is 69.5% of the GDP, against a statutory anchor of 55% falling due in 2028. On the IMF's internationally comparable measure, a different debt parameter, a different calendar basis. The projected ratio is higher still, above 71% this year. Those are two different rulers. I'm giving you both because using them interchangeably is how this debate goes wrong. What isn't in dispute is the consequence. Debt service now absorbs a dominant share of public resources and sharply constrains development and social spending. Every shilling committed to a future charter is a shilling competing with debt service. So, the honest summary, not the angry one, Vision 2030 proved more successful at delivering visible physical and institutional infrastructure than at producing the scale of economic transformation it actually promised. We became better at construction rather than production. And the social gains? Poverty down, water access up, disease deaths down. All of them are real. And they are exactly the kind of thing a proper evaluation would tell us how to attribute, which brings us to the actual problem. 60 kilometers southeast of Nairobi, on 5,000 acres of savanna, sits Konza Technopolis.
What does it take to build the future? Not just ambition, execution. Not just plans, infrastructure. Not just conversation, momentum. Konza Technopolis represents a new kind of African growth ecosystem designed to support innovation, enterprise, technology, and long-term investment. Here, roads connect emerging industries. Utilities support future-scale operations, and development is backed by a clear national vision. This is a functioning ecosystem already taking shape. For businesses, institutions, and investors, the future is moving here. Konza Technopolis, open for business.
Konza was a flagship of the flagships, Africa's Silicon Savannah. Phase 1 targets roughly 17,000 jobs and 30,000 residents, building towards more than 200,000 jobs full build-out. Phase 1, infrastructure is now more than 90% complete. 40 kilometers of road, 170 kilometers of water and drainage, 6 kilometer utility tunnel carrying fiber, power, and water. 120 megawatts substation, a national data center that is operational and serving government and enterprise users. Reported figures for 2025 indicate 77 committed investors and 16 operational entities. So let me be accurate, because the lazy version of this story is that Konza is a ghost town. And it isn't. Things are being built and some of them actually work. But a data center, service roads, and utility tunnels do not by themselves establish that the promised technology, ecosystem, jobs, and residential population have materialized. 16 operational entities is not 17,000 jobs. The city is well behind its original population and employment ambitions. And it's more than a decade past the date those ambitions were set for. And this is a trap to watch for over the next 18 months, because you will be invited to eat by every side, both the government and the opposition. Construction is not delivery. A completed road is an input. A functioning economy is an output. The Kenyan political tradition has always measured inputs, and the reason isn't mysterious. Inputs can be commissioned. Commissioning can be televised. There's a ribbon, a podium, and a crowd. Outputs, on the other hand, outputs take a decade, and nobody has ever cut a ribbon on a productivity statistic. Now, the thing this channel exists to do, give the other side its strongest case, not its weakest, the strongest, because there's a serious argument inside that address, and most of the people shouting this week haven't engaged with it at all. Strip away the comparators and the applause lines, and the president made a genuinely important observation. Article 43 guarantees every Kenyan the right to the highest attainable standard of health, to accessible and adequate housing, to freedom from hunger and food of acceptable quality, to clean and safe water in adequate quantities, to social security, to education. Now, I need to correct something you'll hear said carelessly, including by people on my side of this argument. Those rights are legally enforceable, and Kenyan courts have already issued important decisions on housing, health, and state obligations. In Ruto Bell, the Supreme Court affirmed constitutional protection of housing and related socio-economic rights. The Satros Ayuma judgment did significant work on evictions. Courts have declared violations and granted remedies without waiting for Parliament to reduce every right to a number. So anyone telling you Article 43 is a dead letter is actually wrong. And the judges who have done that work deserve a lot better. But their broad formulations leaves governments considerable room to contest what adequate delivery actually means, how progress should be measured, and whether available resources have been used reasonably. Kenya has sectoral targets, statutory standards, and court-developed principles. What it has never produced is a single enduring national framework translating the full Article 43 promise into measurable development outcomes across administrations. That is a real proposal and a serious one. It could become one of the more consequential developments in Kenyan social policy since devolution, depending entirely on the indicators, the financing, and the enforcement architecture fully adopted, all three of which are currently unknown. There is one more thing about this constitutional argument, and it was Mr. Ndolo who put me onto it.
But William Samoei Ruto goes no.
Huh?
Yes. 2010. He disagreed with the draft constitution and he campaigned against the constitution.
In 2010, when Kenya voted on the constitution this charter is meant to give effect to, William Ruto was the principal spokesperson for the No campaign. He objected to the devolution model as inadequate. He objected to the land acreage clauses. He objected to the powers left with the presidency. He campaigned alongside churches opposed to the abortion provision and the Catholic courts. The document passed with roughly 69% and he conceded. Less than 3 years later, he became the first occupant of the office of the deputy president. An office that this very constitution that he was against created. He has now exercised national executive authority under it for more than 13 years. 9 as deputy president, nearly 4 as president. Now, scrupulous fairness, because there is a cheap version of this point, and I'm not making it in any way. People change their minds. 16 years is a freaking long time. 13 of those years, he has governed under this document and sworn to actually defend it. And honestly, somebody who once argued against a text has usually read it far more closely than somebody who simply uploaded it. But he is now proposing to define in numbers what its rights actually mean. That's an enormous interpretive power claimed over a text he once asked Kenyans to reject in totality by someone who has since spent 13 years inside the institution it built. The question isn't how dare he, the question is what changed? And which reading of Article 43 are we about to actually get? Nobody has put that to him, and somebody should. And the institutional groundwork is not vapor. 2 statutes now exist. The National Infrastructure Fund Act was assented on the 9th of March and commenced on the 25th. It claims to mobilize around 5 trillion shillings over a decade from pension funds, collective investment schemes, and climate finance, explicitly to reduce reliance on public debt. Then the Sovereign Wealth Fund Act was assented to on the 8th of July and commenced on the 24th. 3 components: stabilization, strategic infrastructure investment, and a future generations window, or the Urithi Fund, which under the President's assent statement is to preserve 30% of resource revenue for Kenyans not yet born. When the President says these institutions exist, he's telling the truth. On paper they do, they really actually do exist. And an intergenerational saving principle written into statutes is a genuinely good idea, whoever proposes it. One observation though, and I'm going to state it carefully because the exact allocation language in the Act matters. And I want the Treasury to answer rather than me guessing. The future generations window depends on resource revenue, petroleum and minerals. Kenya has mineral production, but not at the scale this architecture anticipates. And it has no commercial petroleum production at all. So the fund is at present a carefully designed vessel largely awaiting a flow that hasn't properly arrived. That may well be prudent. Norway built its fund before the money peaked, and that is precisely why Norwegian fund, worked. But we've established a fund, and the fund has substantial money in it, are two different sentences, and only one of them was said. A serious constitutional argument, two real statutes, a national conversation beginning on the 12th of August. So what's missing? The bridge. Medium-term Plan 4 runs through 2027. It carries targets, indicators, and a national reporting handbook built specifically to measure them. It's the plan the government is executing today. Nothing in the address explains what happens to it. Does it run to term? Does the charter supersede it, absorb it, or run alongside it? Who writes the closing statement on Vision 2030 and when? Underneath that is the thing I could not find, and I did look. Now, I have to be precise here, because the loose version of this claim is easy to knock down, and officials will knock it down the moment you give them the chance. What exists is a patchwork. Annual progress reports, medium-term plan reviews, institutional audits, program-specific performance audits. The Office of the Auditor General has done a good deal of this work, and the Monitoring and Evaluation Directorate says it undertakes end-term review of medium-term plans, sometimes with external evaluators. That is more than internal marking, and it would be unfair to say otherwise. What I could not locate is one published comprehensive independent assessment measuring the overall vision against its original objectives. And the terminology here matters enormously because it's how the question gets deflected. A financial audit asks whether money was properly accounted for. A compliance audit asks whether procedures were actually followed. A performance audit asks whether resources were used economically. And an outcome evaluation asks whether programs produced the promised results. An end-term review asks what was achieved across a complete planning period. If you walk in demanding an audit, the answer comes back. The Auditor General audits the Secretariat every year. And that answer is true, and it does not touch the question. So let's ask the precise one, and let's keep asking it in these words. Where is the independent end-term performance and outcome evaluation measuring Vision 2030 against its original baselines, targets, costs, and results? There's one more thing. Small, and I wouldn't raise it if the subject wants the integrity of national targets. The 2008 popular version of Vision 2030 says middle income. Later, official documents and progress reports say upper middle income. The president's address used the upper middle income formulation. That may be a drift. It may equally be policy evolution or deliberate clarification. Sessional paper number 10 of 2012 sets out per capita ambitions consistent with a higher target, and governments are entitled to raise their sights. So I'm not going to tell you it's sinister. I'm going to ask the question that resolves it. The government should explain whether the higher target was formally adopted, by what instrument, and which indicator controls the freaking assessment. Because if nobody can answer that, then the target wasn't being measured. It was only being described. Back to Mr. Ndolo. Carefully, because he deserves it, and because this channel's credibility depends on it.
And he talked about certain countries that were approximately in the same level as us, 1964. And then he talked about 10, 20 years later, the progress those countries had made and where we were. And then he brought us to the current situation, where those countries are and where we are now. And in between, he mentioned other countries, other than the guys who were with us in 64. He mentioned other countries midstream who also had made some progress and who were at par with us. And in that conversation, I failed to hear, I can't remember him talking about somebody who had retrogressed seriously. All he pointed out is that some of them, we had slower growth than some of the countries who are with us. And that sitting where we are sitting, we are not doing as good as we should be doing. We've been left behind.
Ndolo noticed that the president's speech named countries that had advanced and not one country that had seriously gone backwards. He's right. I checked it against the full text. He's absolutely correct. South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, Hong Kong, China, Malaysia, Thailand, Indonesia, Mauritius, Vietnam, Cape Verde, Ghana, Zimbabwe, all flagged. 15 comparator countries, everyone presented as a success or a recovery. Not one presented as a country that tried the same thing and stalled. That's a selection bias objection. It's a good one, and as far as I can establish, he was the only person in Kenya who made it in the first week. Now my disagreement. I went looking for one pattern and found a more interesting one. Across 3 or 4 episodes of the Stories of Siasa podcast by CTA, Ndolo does the same thing repeatedly. He widens the frame. He distributes causation across government and generations. He turns to the accuser and asks whether they have standing to actually accuse. I expect you to find that habit protecting the powerful. That is not what I found. In an earlier episode, he takes on a rumor that has been circulating in Kenyan living rooms for months, that the president opened the borders so Somalis could obtain identity documents and vote for him. Ndolo takes it apart methodically.
And yet they fought to contain that border. If we felt we could not contain those people, we could have relinquished that region to Somalia. Since we are calling them Somalis, wacha wakae na ndugu zao in the country known as Somalia.
He points out that Northeastern is Kenyan territory and its people Kenyans, that we even fought a war to keep that border and cannot now pretend the people inside it are foreigners. He calls the special vetting regime imposed on the citizenship documents unconstitutional. He blames the militarized, deliberately underdeveloped treatment of the region going back to the Kenyatta years. He notes that irregular buildings in Nairobi are approved by county officials, not by the people who actually buy them. He reminds his own audience that in the 1960s, one community cherry-picked every senior post in government. So, the complaint about ethnic capture isn't new. It simply changed target. He observes dryly that in this government, the largest block of cabinet slots belongs to his own cousins. That is not apologism. That is a man using history to stop his own audience scapegoating a minority. And he's right on the facts. So the habit isn't partisan. It is how he thinks. Widen the frame, spread causation, ask the accuser about themselves. And most of the time, that's wisdom. It's a thing most missing from Kenyan public argument, and I've built entire episodes on exactly that instinct. But there's a second pattern sitting underneath it, and this is a more sharper. Watch where the agent goes. On Ruto breaking from the entire political establishment to oppose the 2010 constitution, Ndolo's first reaction is, first of all, I am wondering, is that brilliant or brilliant? Notice what the question is doing. Before asking whether the constitution objections were sound, the move is assessed as political craft, and it is assessed admiringly. Then look at how the criticism sounds. The president gets a little caught up in 6 months timelines. He appears to have lost touch with the ground. His deputy is not VPing. Those are real criticisms. They are also remarkably gentle, and more importantly, they are almost entirely tactical. They ask whether the president is managing politics effectively. They do not ask whether he is governing accountably. Those are different questions, and only one of them is about the constitution. So here is my asymmetry, and I want to state it carefully because it's the most important thing in this segment. When Ruto succeeds, the achievement belongs to Ruto. His strategy, his foresight, his network, his ability to see beyond an election. When things fall apart and things fail, the agent expands. Previous governments, weak institutions, history, society, all of us. The individual receives the credit, but the system absorbs the blame. That is not dishonesty. It doesn't require anyone to be paid or coordinated, and I want to be explicit that I found no evidence of either. It tells you something simpler and more useful. Where the man is standing, he is not an academic observing the political establishment from outside. He is a former parliamentary candidate and a lifelong acquaintance of the people whose history he is narrating. That proximity is precisely why his recollections are absolutely valuable. He was there and most of us weren't. It is also why they require an audit of their own. And there's one more turn worth making because it uses his own admiration against the conclusion he draws from it. Ndolo describes the president as a serious consumer of intelligence, a man who must know exactly which regions he has lost and what has to change before 2027. He builds a whole passage on it, and it's persuasive. But if that is true, then one very common defense disappears. A president who is exceptionally well informed cannot also be shielded by the argument that he doesn't know what citizens are actually experiencing. You can be defended as uninformed, or you can be admired as perspective, not both. Competence eliminates one excuse, which brings us back to where we started. The problem is that the Vision 2030 is the one question where widening the frame is actually the wrong move. Because the question isn't who is responsible for 60 years of Kenyan underdevelopment. That deserves the whole frame. And Ndolo answers it better than most people have in any of the podcasts that are currently doing rounds in this country. The question is narrow, technical, and frankly a bit boring. What were the indicators? What were the outcomes? Where is the end-term evaluation? A wide frame cannot answer a narrow question. It can only dissolve it. You ask where the evaluation is, and back comes every government has struggled. Planning is difficult. These things take generations. Be patient. All of which is true. None of which is the evaluation. He identified the selection bias in the president's comparison before anyone else actually did. That's a narrow, technical, evidentiary catch. He is entirely capable of the thing that I am saying he actually did do. And that precisely is my oxymoron with him. He just didn't stay there. He widened back out, and the endorsements arrived before the examination ever did. And this is, listen, I am an avid listener to CTA and Stories as Yes, and it's a brilliant, brilliant podcast. But we have to understand with great power comes great responsibility. And this is now not to Ndolo, because he might have, and perhaps Richard Njau or A-Star might not even know the true sense of why Ndolo is doing this. You might never know intention. But it comes from a good place and like A-Star said, he's doing it selfishly first, to learn, to understand. But he has to also understand that he also has a responsibility to every listener out there that he's reaching out to. That before he just compliantly agrees with what Ndolo is saying, he should be able to research, take the time, read out, find out so that it stops being a narration of a story. And it becomes a healthy debate where you represent us as your listeners to actually want to get to know, above all else, what is true, what is factual, and what is necessary for the country to actually develop. Now back to the episode.
Kenya, where we've come from, the things we've done. I'm not saying Ruto has not done a mess. He's got his own problems. But when you're judging him in that prism. When you see, this thing was rotten from 64. And even before 64, the British were already rotten with their white mischief.
Yes.
Yeah, they're already rotten.
Yes.
Yeah, but it suited them to talk down to us. So it's all over. And we must ask ourselves, when you point a finger, Do you occupy the moral high ground to do that? Do you occupy that space? Is your integrity at such a level that you occupy that space to call this guy corrupt? To call this guy...
The true thing, plainly, because this channel doesn't get to be selective about which true things it says. Corruption did not begin with William Samoei Ruto. It did not begin with Uhuru Muigai Kenyatta, or Mwai Kibaki, or Daniel Toroitich Arap Moi, or Jomo Kenyatta. Every administration in Kenya's independent history has presided over enrichment of the politically connected. Anyone telling you the road started in 2022 or in 2017 or in 2013 is selling you something. And neither did constitutional responsibility. Here's the test. It applies to every president Kenya has ever had and every president Kenya will have. What did the administration inherit? What did it disclose? Investigate, recover, reform, continue, expand, conceal, and what new misconduct occurred under its own authority. Previous governments also did it. Answers exactly one of those. The first, it establishes what was inherited, genuinely useful information, and we should want to hear it. What it does not do, it does not establish innocence. It does not establish equal culpability. It does not even reduce constitutional responsibility. It does not make present performance acceptable. And it does not demonstrate that no alternative course has or will exist. There's an argument that the standard should run the other way entirely. A government in 2026 has things Jomo Kenyatta's government did not have. The 2010 Constitution, for instance, Chapter 6, an Auditor General with real statutory teeth, procurement laws, digital payment trails, and ethics and anti-corruption commissions, 65 years of documented scandal to learn from, more public access to information than any Kenyan government in history. And its own specific campaign promises made to specific people in living memory. You do not get graded on the same curve as people who had none of that. Inheriting better tools raises the standard. It does not lower it in any freaking institution or nation or existence. And here's a distinction Kenyan public debate collapses almost daily.
So back to this anger, violence, bile that is developing as a country. We all have a responsibility. We have to stop pointing fingers at the leadership. We put these guys in office.
Explanation tells you how a situation came about. Exoneration tells you nobody is answerable for it. Two entirely different operations, and performing the first does not produce the second. Context is essential. I build whole episodes out of context. Understanding that Kenya's land problem begins in 1902 and not in 2022 isn't a distraction from the argument. It is the only way to have the argument. But context describes the room a leader is standing in. It doesn't decide what he does while he's in there. Same with the argument about citizens. Yes, we elect these people. Yes, many Kenyans participate in small corruptions daily. The bribes at the roadblock, the shortcuts on the permit. True, uncomfortable, and it should stay uncomfortable. But responsibility follows power. A voter exercises a choice once every 5 years with imperfect information. Under enormous social and economic pressure, a president exercises delegated constitutional authority every day with the treasury, the security apparatus, the intelligence services, and the machinery of the state at his full disposal. Those are not comparable quantities of power. So they cannot be comparable quantities of responsibility. Yes, we put these guys in office, is true. It just isn't a defense. Because it isn't addressed to the person holding all the power. The 12th of August, 4 days from now, what I'd want on the table before anyone signs anything is this. 1. Commission and publish an independent end-term performance and outcome evaluation of Vision 2030, measured against the original baseline target costs and results, with every miss explained. 2. Publish the expert panel's proposal in full before the 12th. Citizens cannot participate in a conversation about a document they haven't been allowed to read. 3. State the target year. If it is 2060, say 2060. A national charter whose deadline was set by a newspaper is not a charter. 4. Explain what happens to medium-term plan 4, which runs until 2027. 5. Publish the Article 43 indicators and explain how they interact with the standard courts have already developed, so the framework strengthens existing jurisprudence instead of quietly displacing it. 6. Name the binding instrument, statutes, constitutional amendment, or convention. Enduring beyond administration is an aspiration, not a mechanism. 7. Name the consequence of failure. Vision 2030's central growth target was never met, and nothing happened to anybody. What specifically is different this time? 8. Say who publishes the performance data, how often, and whether that body can sanction failure or merely report it. State the assumption: growth, revenue, debt, population, climate, private investment. A projection without a stated assumption isn't a projection. It's a hope with a number attached. 10 questions. Not one hostile. Everyone the kind of thing a bank asks before lunch. In 2008, a Kenyan president stood up and told the country where it would be in 22 years. In 2026, a Kenyan president stood up and told the country where it should be within a generation. Between those two speeches sits a constitution, 47 counties, a railway and a highway, poverty down 8 points, water access up 20, 12.8 trillion shillings in debt, 18 million informal workers, real wages below where they were in 2009, and a growth trajectory that was never once sustained. That's a mixed record, not a catastrophe, not a triumph. Mixed, which is exactly the kind of record that requires an evaluation, because it's the kind you can spin in either direction if nobody ever measures it properly. I don't think the conversation beginning on the 12th of August is a bad idea. I want to be clear, because it would be easier and considerably more popular for me to tell you it's a scam, and it isn't. The constitutional argument is real. The funds exist in law. The question about Article 43 is the best question a Kenyan president has asked in years, and answered honestly, it will outlast everyone now arguing about it. But Kenya does not suffer from a shortage of visions. We have had sessional paper number 10, structural adjustment, the economic recovery strategy, Vision 2030, the big four, bottom up. What we suffer from is a shortage of public accounting between one vision and the next. Every time the receipt falls due, a new promise arrives to replace it, and the evaluation is postponed. Never refused. Nobody ever refuses. Just postpones until the next vision is announced, at which point the last one becomes thing of history. And history, conveniently, is nobody's fault. Mr. Ndolo was right about the bank. I'll give him the last word on the shape of this, because it's his instrument and it's a good one. A bank does not lend on ambition. It lends on record. So when Kenya walks into that room on the 12th of August, carrying a 35-year projection, the only responsible thing any of us can ask is what that clerk would ask. Where are the accounts for the last one? Vision is the promise, but measurement is the receipt. And before Kenya is asked to believe in 2060, it is entitled to receive the receipts for 2030. Not because the future doesn't matter, because it matters far too much to build it on an audited past. Like we always say, receipts over vibes. always.